ladies and gentlemen, and thank you for watching the show. This is your top human rights organization review, and I'm your host, Bryce Dolan. Now today on the show, we're going to look at 5 different top human rights organizations and look at the top stories from each one of their websites. To begin the show, the NRC, the Norwegian Refugee Council, visits the innocent civilians living on the front lines in Ukraine. The stories of people who have fled the conflict or are living on the front lines underscore the hard truth. The war in Ukraine has not ended, and the ceasefire has not silenced the guns. There are no signs of past, more peaceful times while driving on the bumpy roads towards one of the villages in the so-called gray zone in eastern Ukraine. Heavily armed soldiers control entry to Zolot 4, a village in the Luhansk region just a few kilometers from the front line on the government-controlled side. The village is only accessible by Ukrainian soldiers, the villagers themselves, or aid convoys. Yesterday, the Norwegian Refugee Council delivered coal to families in the Zolot 4 village, located in no man's land. On the outskirts of the village there is a graveyard, but red signs warn about landmines. Not even the dead are unaffected by this war. We can still hear the shelling and shooting almost every day, says Alexei, one of the many unemployed in Zolot 4 coming to receive coal from the NRC. More than 2.5 years after the war in Ukraine broke out, and nearly 2 years after the signing of the first ceasefire, life remains a daily struggle for survival for many of the 1.7 million registered displaced within Ukraine. Some 3.7 million people are affected by the war according to the United Nations. Over 3 million still require humanitarian assistance. Alexei is one of them. Here in the village there is no work. The mine was closed a long time ago, and people used to go to work in the mine in Purvomesk, which is now in a non-government controlled area and inaccessible for us. Many people are coming back, and as they have not found a better life anywhere else, he says. Now the trucks are unloading coal as the villagers discuss how they can help each other bring the buckets home. About 500 families live in the village, and the coal and firewood provided by the NRC is crucial to protect people from the bitter winter. I do not know how we would exist without humanitarian aid. Of course, we wish for peace and do not want to be aid dependent, says Asia, holding hands with her 8-year-old grandchild, Angelina. So as this prolonged conflict in Ukraine continues, not only do both sides of this conflict suffer casualties, civilians have a daily struggle for survival for the last 2 years, 2.5 years. That is too long for innocent people to struggle just to survive day by day. Now next, Amnesty International has an unfortunate update from Mosul. The Iraqi authorities must urgently investigate reports that fighters wearing Iraqi federal police uniforms tortured and extrajudicially executed residents in villages they captured south of Mosul. Researchers from the organization visited several villages southwest and south of Mosul and gathered evidence indicating that up to 6 people were extrajudicially executed in late October, apparently due to suspicions they had ties to the armed group calling itself the Islamic State. Men in federal police uniform have carried out multiple unlawful killings, apprehending and then deliberately killing in cold blood residents in villages south of Mosul. In some cases, the residents were tortured before they were shot dead execution style, said Lynn Malouf, Deputy Director for Research at Amnesty International's Beirut Regional Office. Deliberately killing captives and other defenseless individuals is prohibited by international humanitarian law and is a war crime. It is crucial that Iraqi authorities carry out prompt, thorough, impartial, and independent investigations into these crimes under international law and bring those responsible to justice. Without effective measures to suppress and punish serious violations, there is a real risk that we could see war crimes of this kind repeated in other Iraqi villages and towns during the Mosul offensive. Now we're going to keep moving on so we can get to all of our stories today. With this next story, there is a video we would like to share with you. And again, we're going to keep updating you with Mosul as that offensive continues. Now, Human Rights Watch calls attention to Ethiopia as this week marks 1 year since the beginning of protests against the government's displacement of farmers, security force abuses, and the repression of opposition voices. Security forces have killed hundreds, detained tens of thousands, and shattered the lives of countless families over the last year. Protester anger boiled over following October's Iraqi cultural festival, when security forces' mishandling of the massive crowd caused a stampede resulting in many deaths. In response, angry mobs destroyed private and government property, particularly in the Oromia region. On October 9th, the government announced a countrywide state of emergency, signaling an increase in the militarized response to protesters' demands for reform. So far, the announced measures appear to codify many of the security forces' abuses thus far, including arbitrary detention. The government's blocking of mobile internet, restrictions on social media, and bans on communication with foreign groups mean little information has gotten out since October 9th. Government limitations on free expression and access to information undermine the potential for the inclusive political dialogue needed to understand protesters' grievances, let alone address them. So, as we have protests in the United States here carried out after the presidential election, we can be thankful that these protests aren't turning out like the protests in Ethiopia. Now next, the UN Watch condemns the UN General Assembly's resolutions that single out Israel. The UN General Assembly adopted 10 resolutions singling out Israel, with only 4 expected to be adopted later this week for the entire rest of the world, with 1 each on Syria, Iran, North Korea, and Crimea. On the renewal of the mandate of a special committee to investigate Israeli practices, one of the 10 resolutions that passed, the vote was 86 in favor, 71 abstaining, and 7 opposed, with the US, Canada, and Australia joining the Jewish state backed by Marshall Islands, Micronesia, and Palau. Those abstaining included EU members, as well as several from Africa and Latin America, including Argentina, Mexico, and Costa Rica. The UN's assault on Israel today with a torrent of one-sided resolutions is surreal, said Hillel Neuer, Executive Director of UN Watch, a Geneva-based non-governmental watchdog organization. Even as Syrian President Bashar Assad is preparing for the final massacre of his own people in Aleppo, the UN adopted a resolution, drafted and co-sponsored by Syria, which falsely condemns Israel for repressive measures against Syrian citizens on the Golan Heights. It's obscene, said Neuer. While there will be a total of 20 resolutions against Israel this session, Not a single UN General Assembly resolution is planned today for gross human rights abusers such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Venezuela, China, or Cuba. At a time when the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas and his state-controlled media incite to the continued stabbing and shooting of Israeli Jews. The UN's response is to reflexively condemn Israel in 10 separate resolutions, each of them one-sided, each of them utterly silent on Palestinian abuses. The resolution drafted annually by Syria condemns Israel for holding on to the Golan Heights and demands Israel hand the land and its people to Syria. It's astonishing, said Neuer, at a time when the Syrian regime is killing its own people by the hundreds of thousands, how can the UN call for more people to be subject to Assad's rule? The timing of today's text is morally galling and logically absurd. So unfortunately, the UN General Assembly, the UNGA, is teaming up on Israel with Syria and those regimes and repressing these Israeli people and refusing to acknowledge a number of other human rights abusers around the world. So we'll keep an eye on the UN General Assembly, and more specifically with the organization UN Watch, to see if we have any updates come with those resolutions to see if Israel can catch a break. Now, to end the show, members of the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and the Red Crescent Movement have adopted a declaration in response to an increased indifference by governments and society to the plight of migrant populations, in which they commit to sensitize and ensure that the causes of migration are understood and that the rights and needs of migrants are recognized, respected, and addressed. It is imperative to implement effective measures in accordance with the fundamental principles, international law, and the movement's resolutions, in collaboration with authorities and other stakeholders to guarantee the respect for the rights of migrants along the migration route in transit in the country of destination and return, strengthening the resilience of migrants and communities, they stated at the conclusion of the regional meeting on the role of the Red Cross movement and migration in the Americas. In the region, national Red Cross societies have made progress in providing assistance and protection to migrants. However, there is still a lot to do to expand the response, improve services, and advocacy for the rights of immigrants, said Jan Gelfand, Deputy Director of the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent for the Americas. So that was our last story for today, ladies and gentlemen, and essentially what the ICRC is doing is helping advocate for the protection of migrants across the Americas. Immigrants who are either returning to their home countries or who are leaving their countries, they are ensuring that these migrants, their rights are respected, that they're protected, that they have the right needs, that they have the right aid with food, water, and medicines, and stuff like that. So some great things that the Red Cross, the ICRC, the Red Crescent movement are doing for the immigrants. But ladies and gentlemen, that does it for today's show. You can check out all of the articles if you want yourself. You can find the links below in the description. Will take you directly to the stories on their respective websites. We hope that the Mosul offensive comes to an end soon, so Iraqi refugees and innocent civilians can breathe a little bit more easier and feel a little bit more protected once that offensive is done, once ISIS is out of there. We hope that in Ethiopia, these protests will end soon. We hope the government will stop oppressing its people and listen to these protests. And of course, we're calling for an end to the war in Ukraine. But that hasn't happened for the last 2 years, so we will keep an eye on Ukraine and a bunch of other things happening around the world. But thank you for watching, ladies and gentlemen. Make sure you subscribe to our YouTube channel, give us a like on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter. That does it for your top human rights organization review, and I was your host, Bryce Dolan. Thank you for watching.